Welcome back, Hour 2. I'm Brooke Baldwin. And as I begin this hour, I actually want to go back. I want to take you back to Monday night. Big moment from our Republican debate there in Tampa, Florida. CNN's Wolf Blitzer asking one of these candidates, ask Ron Paul, what happens when a person without health insurance gets ill, gets severely ill, and requires expensive treatment? Who pays? Listen closely if you would.
This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
But, Congressman, are you saying the society should just let him die?
No. I practiced medicine before we had Medicaid in the early 1960s when I got out of medical school. I practiced at Santa Rosa Hospital in San Antonio, and the churches took care of him. We never turned anybody away from the hospital, and we've given up on this whole concept that we might take care of ourselves, assume responsibility for ourselves, our neighbors, our friends.
So Ron Paul says it's not the government's business. Ron Paul suggests financial responsibility lies with the uninsured's neighbors, their friends, their churches. As it turns out, Ron Paul had a friend who died uninsured. This man there on the left, Kent Snyder, Ron Paul's 2008 campaign manager. Did Ron Paul take care of his friend? I want to bring in Brian Todd, who's been trying to get some answers on this one today. And Brian, what have you learned?
Well, Brooke, you know, as you pointed out just a moment ago, Ron Paul taking that stand the other night, he drew very controversial hollers of approval from the crowd, but he did not bring up that story you just mentioned, a very personal story that relates directly to that issue. As you mentioned, Ron Paul had that top aide, close friend named Kent Snyder. Paul says Snyder was the one who talked him into running for president in 2008. In June of that year, Kent Snyder died of pneumonia. He was 49 years old. He had no health insurance. Colleagues and relatives say a pre-existing condition made it impossible for him to get coverage. I spoke with Ron Paul about this. He kept repeating that Kent Snyder was cared for, that he was not put out on the streets. An aide to Paul tells us Snyder spent several weeks in the hospital and his bills totaled more than $400,000. The aide says that Paul's staff raised more than $50,000 toward that, but the rest of the bill was passed on to Snyder's estate. Now, analysts say this at least shows that Paul is not a hypocrite, that he didn't push for any government-sponsored care for Snyder. But I asked Paul specifically whether this might make him and his followers seem a little bit heartless on this issue. Some might be surprised that you don't take this more personally, given the experience that you had with Kent Snyder.
How could I take it any more personally? Because he was a friend and did what I could to help him. But it is something that, you know, so unfortunate. So it was a tough time for all of us. I mean, our campaign really hadn't quite finished when he got deathly ill, and I had known him for so many years.
Now, despite the fact that about $350,000 of Kent Snyder's bill was passed on to his estate, an aide to Congressman Paul says that to his knowledge, the hospital has not yet tried to make a claim for that money. Brooke?
So you mentioned, you talked to the supporters. They say that, yes, they raised that $50,000. But, in talking to Ron Paul today, did he tell you, Brian, specifically what Ron Paul did, to help defray the cost of his late friend's hospital bills?
Well, he says that, this was really kind of, it played out over just a few weeks, that he did everything he could to raise some money. They went on the internet to raise money for him. They've done that and before and since his death to defray those costs. But, it does kind of, it makes Ron Paul at least, well, analysts say it actually makes him look consistent on the issue, but how it makes him look personally toward his friend, I mean, he says, he reiterates over and over again, he was cared for, he got the care that he needed at the time. It was unfortunate what happened at the end. As for the cost, he said he did everything he possibly could. He repeated that over and over again, did what he could to raise money on the internet to defray those costs.
So to follow up on that, you have this bill, as you mentioned, this medical bill totals some $400,000 for this deceased friend of Ron Paul's. The supporters say they raised the $50,000 against that. Well, would it be Paul's position, based upon what we heard him tell Wolf Monday night, that to keep passing the hat at church, get friends to help until you make the remaining $350,000? Is that how he would say it would work?
Well, I think he believes that that's part of how it would work. He implied in the debate the other night and since then that it is the role of friends, relatives, others to help, but also that churches and charities could help. He mentioned that, and you rolled that soundbite where he talked about that. And when I asked him specifically, though, you know, look, in this day and age, do you think that churches and charities could really take up that financial burden of $400,000 like was the case in Kent Snyder's, with Kent Snyder's bills? He said, no, that couldn't happen today because the government's driven up the cost. So he steers the issue back to his point that a government role in health care just does nothing but drive up the costs of health care.
Just quickly, I'd love to hear from, you know, Kent Snyder's family's perspective on things. I'm sure you've tried to call them. And any call back?
No, not yet. We've tried to reach someone who we believe is his sister out in Kansas. We've not heard back from her.
Okay. Brian Todd, thank you very much.
Sure.
And by the way, don't miss Brian's report next hour with Wolf in the Situation Room. We'll have a little bit more on the story, 5 o'clock Eastern, right here on CNN.
2 days after our groundbreaking CNN Tea Party presidential debate in Tampa, Ron Paul still getting some heat about the answer he gave me to one of my questions. We have some new information to put the Republicans' views on health care into some context. For that, we asked Brian Todd to do some checking. Brian, what are you finding out?
Wolf, as you know, Ron Paul stuck to his position that night. He never wavered. But what he didn't do, he didn't bring up a very personal story, a story of a close aide that he lost 3 years ago, a story that takes this way beyond the hypothetical for Ron Paul.
It was one of the most pointed moments in the early debate season. Wolf Blitzer asked Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul, a staunch opponent of a government role in health care, what should happen to a 30-year-old man who can afford insurance, chooses not to buy it, then becomes catastrophically ill.
He needs intensive care for 6 months. Who pays?
That's what freedom is all about, taking your own risk. This whole idea that you have to prepare and take care of everybody.
Asked if society should let the man die, Paul said no, and said in his experience, churches, charities, friends, and relatives would help. It's a circumstance Ron Paul knows intimately. In June of 2008, Paul's former campaign chairman, Kent Snyder, who Paul says talked him into running for president that year, died of pneumonia. Snyder had no insurance. Colleagues and relatives say a pre-existing condition made it impossible for him to get coverage. I spoke with Paul about the experience.
Did you try to help him? Did you want to help him at the time with his bills?
Absolutely. He was a close friend of mine. He had worked with me for 12 years. We did everything we could because we knew he was having a struggle paying his bills, so we did what we could to raise as much money as possible on the internet.
Snyder's bills totaled more than $400,000, according to an aide for Paul. The aide says Paul's staff raised more than $50,000, but the rest of the bill was passed on to Snyder's estate. The aide says to his knowledge, the hospital has not yet tried to make a claim for that money. Analysts don't see this case hurting Ron Paul politically.
I think this story tells you who Ron Paul really is as opposed to the politicians who say one thing and do another. He's a guy who's pretty principled. He knows what he believes. He takes stands that sometimes can look really difficult to voters.
Does this make Paul and his followers seem heartless?
Some might be surprised that you don't take this more personally, given the experience that you had with Kent Snyder.
How could I take it any more personally? Because he was a friend and did what I could to help him. But it is something that, you know, was so unfortunate. So it was a tough time for all of us. I mean, our campaign really hadn't quite finished when he got deathly ill, and I had known him for so many years.
Ron Paul made very clear that Kent Snyder was cared for. Colleagues say he spent several weeks in the hospital. When I asked if he really believes that churches and charities could take on the financial burden for people like Snyder, Paul said not today because the government has run up the costs. Wolf.
You know, at least one Democratic group is now trying to use this for political gain.
That's right. It's a group called Protect Your Care. It's a Democratic-leaning group called Protect Your Care. It's launched a new ad called Let Him Die. It's a takeoff of your question to Ron Paul and the audience's answer. Now, we have to reiterate, Paul said no when you said that. As you remember, it was the audience who said yes. Very controversial there. And this new ad says something like, you know, would Mitt Romney let him die? So there's a lot of traction in that exchange with Ron Paul.
Not everyone in the audience. There were a few scattered, comments that came out. But when I heard your report just now, the whole notion of this individual who worked for Ron Paul couldn't get health insurance because he had a pre-existing condition under the new law the law that President Obama and the Democrats pushed, you could get health insurance if you have a pre-existing condition. Did you get into that with Ron Paul?
You know, we talked about that. He is not wavering from his position that the government should have no role in this. Churches, charities, friends, relatives have to take up the mantle here. You know, but he does admit these days $400,000, churches, charities, and friends usually can't come up with that kind of money. You know, but he's not wavering is really the bottom line.
All right. Thanks very much, Brian, for that report.